One of the most interesting aspects about the art of film is how cinematography can be used to tell a story or elicit certain emotions in the viewer. Stuff like shot composition is intrinsically meaningful as it exists not only to be functional but also to be artistic. Most video games don't possess this virtue outside of games with fixed camera angles due to the camera being player controlled, so cuts can't be made during gameplay as it would be particularly jarring. During gameplay, the camera needs to be entirely functional as the player needs to keep track of the character, and as such is usually restricted to pretty bland placement. Games cannot take the same liberties as films can. Being able to cut to a close-up of a certain item or facial expression without breaking the pace would be overly difficult in most games. Many games nowadays will opt to force camera control away from the player or simply deliver information through means such as text. However, certain games manage to find a more elegant solution that fits more naturally into the world. In this video, I'd like to take a look at some examples of developers who have taken an inventive, unique, or otherwise neat approach towards conveying particular information to the player through visuals. To start with, I'm going to look at probably the closest thing games have to shot composition, which is how the camera will reframe itself of the player's volition. The Metal Gear Solid games do this, and I'm not just talking about all those cutscenes. What I'm talking about is the way the camera shifts when you press up against a wall. In the top-down view, all a player has to go on in regards to enemy position is the radar, so being able to quickly move the camera to focus on them while staying safe is a valuable feature. What's more is geometry in MGS 1 and 2 is quite sharp and blocky, so by leaning to look at an enemy, lines that guide the eye towards them are constructed naturally. The environments in, say, Snake Eater are more organic, so this kind of thing doesn't happen, but it makes up for it by having a more conventional 3D camera, at least on the HD and Subsistence versions. A similar technique is used in a number of games. In The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, if you change the direction of the wind before setting out sailing, the camera will default to this angle. The game can assume that as you've just changed the wind direction, you're likely headed in that direction towards your location, so it can zoom in and frame the subject of interest without having to worry about the rest of the ocean being visible. Slight tangent, but this is one of the little nitpicky things I had about Twilight Princess. The placement of the horse on screen was just kind of generic. It's slapped directly in the middle, and the camera angle ensures you're looking at the ground most of the time. Shadow of the Colossus did basically the same thing a lot better. When riding the horse, Wander is shoved over to the side to give the landscape more screen presence. The low angle also helps exaggerate the vastness of the landscape. The world in Shadow of the Colossus contains a lot of high structures and cliffs, so by placing the camera at a low angle, you get a better view of their size. The camera also pulls back while riding the horse to give a greater sense of speed. The placement of Wander and the horse also actually follows a photography and cinematography technique known as the rule of thirds, which may be why it's just naturally pleasing to the eyes. Shadow of the Colossus and Twilight Princess both have relatively large, empty worlds, but a simple perspective change makes traversing one feel a lot more grand and almost beautiful than another. Of course, it's no use having a cool shot if it's a detriment to the gameplay. This is why the Wind Waker and Metal Gear Solid only pull to these positions when they can assume the player will be looking right at their subject of interest. The 3D Mario games often use framing at the start of their levels to give the player a brief overview of the level's layout. In each of these examples, the camera defaults to a slightly lower angle than usual so as to give a view of a good portion of the level before setting off. This allows the player to get a general sense of direction and what the level will entail. Puzzle Plank Galaxy in Super Mario Galaxy 2 works well in this way. Right from the start, it doesn't frame Mario from the usual behind the back position, instead it purposefully places him sideways, as if the game is encouraging you to get into a more normal position. It also has the camera just in the right position where you can see there's definitely a platform below with enemies on it. Just from this shot, the first objective is made clear: get to this lower platform. As you move to an upright position, having possibly ground pounded on a few of the smaller blocks along the way, the camera naturally moves along to frame this platform directly below what the player is standing on. There's an obvious hole in the platform, the same shape as the thing you're standing on, and part of it is just out of frame, implying that there must be a way to bring the rest of it in frame by getting there. From this point, it seems obvious to ground pound as that's your fastest way of moving downwards, and there, from those two simple shots, the game sets up and lets you solve a very basic puzzle, teaching the level's main gimmick from there on out. There are even other examples in the very same level. This platform is just the right size so that once you land on it, the first three things you see are 3 squares with the ground pound signs, a launch star just out of reach, and once again a block cut just out of frame by the bottom of the screen, implying there's something to see on the other side. Mario games are obviously designed so that they can be beaten by children, and while other developers may approach this by cramming a level with signs telling you where to go, most levels in the 3D Mario series manage to convey this very quickly and efficiently through very basic use of the way things are framed or cut just out of shot to invite the player to go after them. Visuals and level design have been used for atmosphere or story purposes in some games. Spec Ops: The Line had a pretty cool use of colour to establish the plot and tonal progression of the title. Now, whether or not you think the game is good or mediocre or just outright sucks is a whole other can of worms, but it's hard to overlook what was done aesthetically for the game despite being in arguably the most oversaturated genre of its time. At the beginning of the story is one of the most basic colour contrasts there is, soft oranges and blues placed together to bring focus to the city in the distance. The initial camera placement also accentuates the distance from the city by giving the road there more screen space. Such a basic contrast use lets the player know that so far the mission is very regular and basic. Upon reaching the second main act, colours are dull and dirty, with greys and greens permeating it start to reflect on the unfortunate turn the mission has taken. While a lot of this section does use darker, more depressing colours, there are still some moments here and there reminiscent of the beginning, conditioning the player to think that maybe the mission can still end as initially planned. Then comes the most obvious, which is the final major section of the game. It offers the same kind of environment as the beginning, but the colour use produces a totally different effect. The blue used to contrast the landscape in the beginning is pretty much gone, and the once soft oranges are intensified, so this act almost solely consists of harsh oranges and reds. The lack of contrast means the player doesn't have anywhere to really rest their eyes, and the deep orange and reds mimic the hellish turn the mission has taken.
Quaint, very post-apocalyptic.
3 main portions of the game, 3 main colour schemes, all reflecting the current tone of the story. It was actually a pretty nice use of colour for modern military shooters, even if the game does run on Unreal Engine 3, so there's loads of pop-in and framerate issues on consoles. Demon's Souls also had a strange little manipulation of the level design to affect how the player saw a certain part of the game. In the Valley of Defilement, there's a well-known moment where what seems to be a normal-sized enemy from a distance turns out to be gigantic when up close. To me at least, what appears to be the way they did this was first by making the platform get wider near the depraved one. Had the planks stayed the same size, due to them getting further away from the camera, the enemy in the distance would look obviously disproportionately large, giving away the whole trick. The same principle is used for the hole in the background. Had this been any other location in any other level, there would be no reason for this not to be human-sized. By making the hole just big enough for the depraved one to fit through, there's no visible difference in size, again making it seem like it's just a regular-sized enemy. It's only once you actually move closer that you can see the trick, and by then it's probably too late unless you move really slowly. Designing and creating a level is one thing, but thinking through exactly how it will look through the perspective of the game's camera is something else entirely, and really shows off the creativity of the team. There are plenty of other cool examples of how the camera or lighting have been used in games, say the way the Super Smash Bros. Series uses the camera to define the safe zone of the stage, or how Xenoblade Chronicles featured a camera that let you zoom in or out to accommodate for the very wide or tighter areas throughout the game. There's also moments like this little bit in Chaos Theory where the silhouette created by a floodlight allows you to see the position of patrolling guards from a safe environment. However, I feel the easy solution of stopping the player in their tracks to highlight something or propping text up on screen is used far too often nowadays, as opposed to creating environments that can naturally guide the player's eyes to things, or using the camera and lighting to stimulate certain moods. Some of this stuff is a little hard to spot in games, seeing as the effect is usually subconscious, but wherever this stuff shows up it's almost always positive. If you have any cool examples that I may have missed, then leave a comment or send me a message and I'll check it out.